Thank you so much for having me here. It's absolutely a pleasure and privilege, and I was very touched when I got this invitation. And I was wondering from what perspective would I speak this evening? Because in many ways, I'm not a person who has, in that sense, worked with conservation. One has had an understanding, one has had sympathies, one has felt sort of in synergy with other people who've worked with conservation, who've worked with heritage, but it's not the field that I've really acted in. In fact, when I worked and I wrote Alice in Buleshwar, I always kept saying that the book is not about nostalgia about the past, and the book is not even a plea for conservation. So there's a position that I kept articulating at all points in time. And in that sense, I was really wondering what I would sort of speak or how I would sort of steer and gear my conversation or talk this evening. And for a Bombay boy to sort of speak in front of a Delhi audience about Delhi buildings and heritage was making me very nervous, and it still is keeping me nervous. So I'm not going to do that. Probably that's the second shock I've given Annabelle this evening. I gave her a shock, which was a real selfie moment when I said, I don't have a PPT presentation. And this is the second thing, that I'm not going to speak on Delhi architecture. I would have loved to speak on Bombay architecture, but I'm also not going to do that because that would have just sort of made my conversation as if it is a comparative presentation between my experiences in Bombay and your experiences in Delhi. But there are a couple of thoughts that I have been playing around with, I have been sort of working with, and I'm planning to present those. And as you will see in the paper that I sort of read out and discuss with you, that these come from a couple of positions that I have been in myself. One is very important for me, and a space that I've learned a lot is the space of teaching, the sort of the responsibility of setting up teaching curriculum, pedagogic structures, and the decision as to why do you teach something and how or what do you teach. The second position has been sort of working very closely with contemporary architecture in this country in sort of my work with Domus over the last 6-7 years. And besides that, it has been sort of living and growing up in Bombay, which in many ways has had its own history of debates, arguments, in the context of space, in the context of the city, and in the context of heritage and conservation. To point out, for example, as a student of architecture, I grew up, or I was a student of architecture in the 1990s when actually the Bombay conservation movement sort of took shape. And as a student, one was sort of visiting lectures at the Max Miller Bhavan, which the UDRI used to organize at that point in time. But at the same time, we were in Sen Kapadia's Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute for Architecture, which sort of pushed us to debate a certain sense of what it means to be contemporary in India. So you sort of lived and struggled between these kind of two poles. So it's a couple of these positions that I sort of humbly come and present this paper in front of you. There are people that I've really learned from who are sitting right in this audience. Just to mention two, Mr. Menon, his writings have been sort of very instrumental and very important. And also Dr. Annapurna Garimella, who's here, with whom sort of many conversations, including reading some of her work on architecture, has been very crucial in shaping some of the thoughts that I work with today. So without much, I sort of get into this presentation. So once again, good evening, and it is truly my privilege to be delivering this lecture today. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me this platform. I will not be really sticking to the broader theme of modern architecture and modern architectural heritage in Delhi. As much as I understand the location and occasion, and the fact that I could have engaged with it myself, although my work is not primarily or specifically on Delhi, I just feel the urge to use this space and occasion to dwell upon some thoughts I have had regarding conservation, history, and architecture. I have worked much with the question of history in architecture and in the way we understand and look at and learn from cities. but I have never directly engaged with conservation. In fact, I have always clarified that my work with Buleshwar and Kalba Devi, these neighborhoods in Bombay, the once native town areas in colonial Bombay, is actually not a plea for conservation, but a project towards the recovery of the city at large. It is a project towards our engagement with history as a practice of everyday life. Every time I walked the streets and buildings of Buleshwar, I thought of how people live and why they live the way they do. But I also wondered, why did these people turn violent and riot against each other in 1992 and 93? If there was to celebrate something about architecture and the coming together of people as communities and migration histories, there was something to worry about violence and hatred in the same spaces. These neighborhoods were my laboratory for years to understand how we as human beings and we as citizens occupy space, architectural space, but also the space of life. History was palpable in every building facade I saw, and I attempted to decode and read it as a novel. To read architecture as a novel, which was in fact the title of the very first published article that I had in my life, which Annapurna published as the editor that time with Marg. And I was working with a city neighborhood that was rich in ornamentation, which was also very crucial to my first book, Alice in Buleshwar, but also my PhD work, which actually is also a recovery of the ornamentation as a way of entering into architecture, much against the way sort of modern architecture reads itself. So here, all buildings were my sites for evaluating the culture of people and citizens that we are. History was the carpet I had to sit on and fly with to be able to comprehend the contemporary. My fear of reading my project as one that leads towards a conservational approach was probably that I was interested in reading history as an alive and vibrating, breathing, bleeding, growing organism, rather than a story of the past. Yet I knew and believed that this reading of the area somewhere would rescue, or at least make some people think of what we have inherited as a contemporary society and culture. There was no plea to conservation, but there was a plea to understanding change. There was a plea to debate and discuss change. And there was a belief that understanding the history of our everyday lives will somewhere make us critical of how we change, when we change, and why do we change, rather than the question of change itself. In the process, architectural form, its images, its materiality, its forms of construction, its repository of meanings, all of this emerged crucial to a project of history. Now, for me, conservation, either as material conservation or through forms of archiving and documentation, or through debates on the shape of memory, was a project to be pursued, where conservation was a way to understand the journeys of history as well as our everyday lives in the present. And so conservation was not about architecture, but it was about life. But architecture was the medium through which life could be measured and reconstructed, and this architecture was an ever-changing one. Buildings look permanent and they last long, a reason why all recovery and Renaissance projects play so closely with architectural objects. Because buildings last, they live on in time. But buildings are never the same across time. They only cheat us into believing that they are the same. Architecture changes with the way cultures and societies perceive them. Meanings, symbolisms, values, they all change. And so, as I have argued in a very short text long ago, every conserved building is a new building, as it interprets the past in the act of conservation. Conservation is contemporary. It indeed is. Another way, then, that one could say that architecture and conservation are intrinsic projects of history, where history itself is an ongoing and live project. Let me leave this set of conversations here and move to another argument that has been brewing in my mind for a while. In my work with contemporary architecture, as well as with cities and the lives of people, and very much my research with Alice in Buleshwar, there has been a key moment I have always quoted. 6th December 1992. The day Babri Masjid is demolished, even if symbolically so. I do not think that we can ever after this day talk of India without referring to this very disgusting moment in modern India's contemporary history. We should not forget that besides the literary and mythological narratives of the Ramayana, the object around which the debate is constructed is a piece of architecture, a built object of brick and stone and mortar. To witness this fate of history as a teenager has left a permanent mark, and I realized this only the day I started working as a teacher of history of architecture. Every image and every visual plate and textual description in books by Percy Brown or Bannister Fletcher reminded me of that image, the image of the dome being broken down. What is the idea of India we are discussing in the classroom? Because from discussing Sanchi Stupa, a dome of sorts again, to Khajuraho, to the demolition of Babri Masjid, it is all about the identity of place and religion that architecture holds within its body. The one way that we have always sort of imagined, or the only way we have constantly imagined history of architecture can be written. History changes meanings, and the newer meanings accumulate, changing the architecture that comes down to us from history. One work of research and art history that I have learned a lot about this relationship between objects from history, the idea of history, and their contemporary and current currency, values, and imagination is the classic essay on the Didarganj Yakshi by the art historian and scholar of visual culture, Dr. Tapati Guha Thakurta. And in that sense, very often, reading the architectural object has been reading a certain kind of an historiography, a historiography of perception, a historiography of ritual, and a historiography of the way the building is written about. But let me return to where I began this story. The consciousness of kind between my person as a citizen and my self-role as a professional, as an architect, that came into play between witnessing an event of national shame and the space of a classroom where we teach texts and hopefully ideas too. The classroom and the national space were in conflict, but also my understanding of the courtyard, the quintessential motif in Indian architecture, celebrated for its bonhomie and people coming together and all that jazz, challenged when these same courtyards, whether in the wadis of Bombay or the chawls of Bombay in 1993 or the poles of Ahmedabad in 2002, were used to harbor hatred and ammunition to be fired against an imagined other. When the courtyard was not simply about coming together, but it was about coming together to destroy some other. Do I then celebrate the courtyard? Or can I ever now look at the courtyard outside its own stories of love, care, but also hatred and othering? Well, indeed, architecture is a complex, bloody thing, and to talk of its history and heritage, now even more complex. My consciousness as a commentator on contemporary architecture in India, or so-called historical architecture in India, comes from these moments of dilemma, where architecture eludes my understanding of the built form as image, and the built form as space. The demolition has been a key marker for me in my interest and research of urban neighborhoods and the meaning of architectural form. In the curious case of India's history between colonialism and nationalism, regionalism and liberalization. While recently doing a set of 3 lectures as a series at the Centre Pompidou in Paris on architecture and design in modern and contemporary India, I started the first lecture with the demolition of the Babri Masjid. And I realized that I started my third lecture, the last of the three, with the demolition of the Pragati Maidan buildings, the Hall of Nations, designed and constructed by Mahendra Raj and Raj Rewal. In a sense, for me, that suddenly was a moment of realization that my architecture's history, for me, is in between these two demolitions, Babri Masjid and the Hall of Nations. The Hall of Nations demolition, I approach here from two positions. First, no doubt the demolition is once again an act of aggression and ego, and shameful not simply in the act of its demolition per se, but also in the manner in which the demolition was carried out. But the bigger issue for me has been the total disregard and ignoring of the architectural fraternity. How has a profession and fraternity that at one point held influence in one way or another on how the national space will be imagined can today be totally disregarded? Second, is this just a demolition of another old building, as many conservation debates make it sound to be? Or the demolition of the Hall of Nations is something larger than that? And I think if we don't make that difference, or if we don't figure out that space, I think we are sort of playing a blind man's buff by talking simply of conservation as something that is against development, or conservation as an act of preserving old buildings. We are up against a very different kind of a debate, I feel, which the Hall of Nations marks. The demolition of the Hall of Nations was in April 2017. And to evaluate the above two issues, I would sort of go to an exhibition that Rahul Mehrotra, Ranjit Hoskote, and myself curated in January 2016, which was a year before the demolition. There were many issues and many discussions that led the three of us to work over 4 years putting together a historical review as well as a critical reading of architecture and its practice in India since 1947. But as our discussions and research matured, as we shaped the exhibition as curators, and once the exhibition was in place, one of the two or three central pillars of the exhibition was the role of the architect. What is indeed the role of the architect in society and culture today? Sadly, in today's context, not much. I do not wish to rant as to how there is no good architecture in India, because there is good amount of good work in India, though through very young and contemporary studios. And 7 years working as an editor with Domus India has constantly been trying to make sense of architecture practice and its contributions in contemporary India. So this is not coming from a rant where I separate the production of architecture of a certain kind from the role of the architect in contemporary cultures and society. But as such, on a wider and larger scale, the architect as a professional, or the architect as a profession that deals with society and aesthetics, cultural imaginations, and production of the built environment, the presence of the architect is next to nothing. On the streets, you either know of architects who are building playing to a real estate market and that aesthetic, or otherwise you know of dozens of architects who are making pretty homes for rich and famous. Nothing wrong with both these practices. They're fairly valid practices and they have their own historical pinnings and belongings. But the problem is when the imagination of architecture or the profession is limited to only two such typologies of practice. In which way the architect is reduced from being a social and cultural contributor, shaping debates in aesthetics, to being a lifestyle designer. The architect is a decoration rather than the necessary form itself. To sort of briefly get into the State of Architecture exhibition, where some of this reading was important, where the exhibition was crucially divided into three phases since independence: 1947 to emergency, emergency to liberalization, and post-liberalization. It's very clear in the early years, including the work that many sort of governments at the center as well as at the state worked closely with architects in shaping the built environment. To the times when you come to the post-emergency period, especially the 80s, when the state has a certain sense of withdrawal, but various questions, whether in forms of sustainability or what we today call sustainability, or questions of architectural material, or questions of architects' interventions in social spaces, is something that is self-initiated by various kinds of practices. To the period that you come post-1991, where there is a completely new generation of architects that emerge and shape contemporary practice, but at the same time, the sort of the overview or the larger sense of the architectural practice is reduced to this imagination of the lifestyle designer. In this context, one sort of then talks about the demolition. The demolition of the Hall of Nations, despite the protests, and in fact protests of a very sober kind. We constantly talk of about more than 500 schools of architecture, but there is absolutely no presence of a certain kind of a student space or a certain kind of a protest space that comes from the profession. So the demolition, despite these protests, indicates the state of the profession, which is really a question as to what is the architect doing today? What is the space that the architect is sitting in? What is the space that the architect is working in? It also raises the question as to why the understanding of heritage, or simply put, older and important buildings, separated from contemporary practice. And I think the other sort of argument is that contemporary practice as an architect and conservation practice have seen this kind of a divide at all points in time. We do not sort of see that contemporary architecture as the production of new buildings literally emerges from the same context that plea for conservation emerges from. But we as a profession, either through discourse of any form or through pedagogical structures, have not been able to see this as one continuum practice, but have seen it as different areas or different kinds of practice. Rather than viewing all practices as practice within architecture, and that of all of us are dealing with a stock of buildings and neighborhoods, is there an argument for an expanded role of the architect? Within the professional imagination of architecture is the imagination of being a cultural contributor. In this situation, there is constantly a sense of lament that we work within. Whether we work as architects making newer projects or architects working in conservation, there is a constant sense of lament that architects work with. But that lament has not really productively been expanded into understanding or fashioning a kind of space that the architect can occupy or architecture can occupy. The lament has never turned into a certain kind of a protest. And in this question, the profession lacks a certain kind of political thinking. In what way has the profession outlined its political thinking? Does the profession have a political basis or even a set of varied political bases? I think these are sort of important questions that we do not encounter either in professional conversations or in the space of the school. This connects to the second argument in this matter. Was the demolition of the Hall of Nations simply an issue of newer imaginations? A careless set of agendas in the corridors of power, ill-informed people in the positions of power, etc., which has normally been the talk around conservation or losing architecture? Or was this, the demolition of the Hall of Nations, a politics of architecture? That the profession has no language or tools to handle anymore or currently. There is a politics of architecture and there is a politics of nationalisms in this demolition. And this we need to understand from the perspective of history and the imagination of architecture. The imagination of architecture as shaped in all our practices today. And I think this is a key thing that I feel where some of the conservation debates in the discussions on contemporary or modern architecture are not able to hold ground. And that is that we are taking a certain debate and an argument that we've had for colonial or early 20th century sort of architecture. We are taking the same sort of language to this modern architecture without sort of realizing that it is a different ball game today. And something that I, for example, just heard from Annabelle in a conversation, enforces this idea that here it is not simply this kind of conservation versus development kind of an issue, but it is actually that architecture has gone to a different kind of politics that we are not able to handle, whether it is the production of new kind of buildings or whether it is the sort of conservation that we are talking of modern architecture. The three axes that I have been trying to work with, history, the language of discourse and practice of architecture, and the role of the architect come together here. Conservation is not dealing here between heritage and development, but we are in a fierce battle of politics and meanings, markets and ideologies. If not us, surely the objects of our affection, the building, architecture, is today in the midst of the storm of all these that I just mentioned. Politics of meaning, the arguments of materials, and markets of aggressive economics, bazaars of fierce politics. In this situation, we have, as it seems, decided to withdraw, consciously or subconsciously. We lament over beauty or the loss of beauty, or patronage or the loss of patronage, and we don't realize who has snatched away the object of our affection, architecture, away from us. Is architectural object even today so safe within the profession, or does it belong only to the profession, or there are completely new set of professionals, including project management companies, that are actually shaping architecture? So this has sort of broadly been the areas where sort of some of the thoughts that have moved into, especially when one first heard of the demolition of the Hall of Nations, my instinct went to this conversation that we had in State of Architecture as the role of the architect. And in that case, I think as a profession, we have given it easy to the demolition. We have withdrawn in a certain sense as being strong cultural commentators and political entities who have a certain kind of a social presence. I think today it is not much about the conservation of buildings, but it is conservation about the architect. The architect itself as an active species who can think on his or her own, or who can act or has the possibility of being shaping built environments, is a lost or a endangered sort of species in some sense. And the recovery of this space is as much in understanding the role of the architect as one who makes everyday buildings, as much as the role of the architect in understanding the broader sense of a built volume, forget the word heritage, but a built volume that all of us occupy at all points in time. And the other sort of key thing is that contemporary practices and their engagement with history becomes extremely important. That history that gets reserved in a certain space of the romantic, in a certain space of history, is something where the other way that we have created a problem. One of my sort of peeve areas is walks, heritage walks, including the fact that I would do heritage walks in Bhuleshwar and Kalba Devi area, but I would remind people that every walk I do is like doing a lecture for me. And you don't get a trivia or tidbits on the building, but you sort of listen to me through its arguments. Through the arguments of the building, through questions of history, through arguments about Bombay. Histories of migration, histories of how people come together. But for example, the heritage walk has also reduced our cities to trivia. And we have sort of lost sense when a walk was a certain way of building up engagement. It has become a Sunday morning entertainment. So that you take certain people who feel very good about having its heritage and then go back home. But has that mode of the walk really built a sense of engagement where you understand that even if you're living 5 suburbs away, that in some sense of network, you're 5 suburbs away and the heritage part of the city are intrinsic and connected with each other. So I think there are areas within our own sort of thinking and practice that we have sort of either misplaced or lost them on the way.